In this Path of Exile 2 video, I'm going to be going through some helpful information that should help players get through the main campaign of the game. This guide is aimed at brand new players or players that are just starting off the campaign and have played a little bit or are not very familiar with Path of Exile in general. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is support gems. This is something that you've probably figured a little bit about if you've been already playing Path of Exile 2. But essentially what these gems do is they allow you to add things to your skills, just like in the first game, that change some of the properties of those skills. You're only going to be able to have up to 2 support gems for any given skill at the beginning of the game, but as you progress further and further, eventually you will gain items that allow you to add more support skill gem slots to your skills. So if you're wondering how you do that, the way you do that is by progressing the game. Secondly, when you go to craft support skill gems, if you mouse over a given skill, it only gives you a few options. However, you can select from different categories of skills, being strength, intelligence, and dexterity. Each has their own category, which allows you to see the full list of the support gems that you can craft from these. And I highly recommend going and looking through these when you're crafting support skill gems, instead of just trying to craft the ones that are available if you mouse over the skills. So get in the habit of doing that. The next thing is that for support skill gems, you're not going to be able to use 2 copies of the same support skill gem across your skills. So you really need to pick and choose which support skill gems you want on specific skills. There are many that would be great on multiple skills, but unfortunately you're not allowed to do that. So you really need to try out different combinations and see what works best for you. And lastly, the types of support skill gems that you can use are limited by your attributes. Your strength, dexterity, and intelligence will limit the amount of support skill gems of that same color that you can use. So if you're a character that uses strength primarily, for example, like a warrior, you're going to use predominantly strength-based support skill gems. However, if you put some points into dexterity, some points into intelligence, you'll increase your limit from one of each of those types of support skill gems for each 5 points that you put in. This will allow you to make better use of them if you need in your particular build. As a new player, I highly recommend that you don't go too crazy putting points into attributes that are not your main attributes. So if you're a strength-based class, try and stick to strength and put very minimal points in intelligence and dexterity unless you know what you're doing and you're a more advanced player. But early on, try and stick to one attribute and try and stick predominantly to those types of skill gems when possible. And something else that I want to mention is that on the skill screen, you can actually see the DPS of each skill. You might have seen this already, but this actually updates in real time, meaning if you swap out a piece of gear or you swap out a weapon or you swap out a support skill gem, you will see the damage of this increase or decrease depending on what you're doing. And it's a great way to tell like if a piece of equipment is actually better than what you're using now. So make sure your skill screen is open when you equip new pieces of gear to see if it sends your DPS up or to see if it sends it down. Obviously, DPS is not the only factor when choosing gear, but early on in the game when you're trying to kill things more quickly, to progress more quickly, it's a great way to see, if you're making improvement with some upgrades or not. So the next thing I want to mention is that you can farm skill gems if you need more of them. They are random drops in this game, so you can farm them from like bosses or elite monsters to get more of them. But just keep in mind that if you're looking for like the next tier of skill gem to improve a skill or to unlock like a higher tier of skill, you will have to level up your character for these to drop. So progressing the game is the best way to get higher and higher level skills and to improve your skills further. So don't spend too much time farming unless you're actually stuck at lower levels, and instead just try and progress the main campaign. However, something I do want to mention is that it benefits you a lot to do the side quests as you make your way through the main game, because a lot of these are in areas you're going to go through anyway, and a lot of them have passive benefits that are permanent to your character, either with passive skill points that you can get, or maybe like a permanent resistance buff or a permanent stat buff. So make sure that you're doing the side quests that are available to you while you progress the main campaign, because it's just easiest to do it that way, and you will get things that are very valuable to your character. The next thing I want to mention is that there's a very important NPC in this game that kind of plays the Deckard Cain role. He is called the Hooded One. You unlock him about 1 to 2, maybe 3 hours into the game, depending on your progression speed. And he'll let you identify items at will without any cost, which is fantastic. So make sure you use him for identifying your items once you have them unlocked. But the other thing that he'll do is he'll allow you to respec points in your passive skill tree for a certain amount of gold. So if you find that like maybe you went a direction and you want to try a different direction, you can use him to try different things out. I highly recommend doing this very early on in the game because the skill point cost increases as your character level increases. So it's going to get more and more expensive later on. It's still not that expensive between like levels 1 and 30, I would say. But once you get like much above that, it starts getting more and more expensive. So try and experiment early on with as you get new skills and see which direction you want to go. But then maybe get a little bit more conservative as you get closer and closer to higher levels and think out exactly what you want to do before you spend a lot of gold on respecking. And something else that I would have mentioned that I mentioned just a little bit ago, but I want to mention in a larger context, is that you can farm bosses for drops in this game. A lot of times you'll find yourself not getting gear upgrades for very long stretches in Path of Exile 2 because you need a specific type of weapon for your class. It needs to have certain stats. It needs to be better than what you have, etc., etc., etc. So it can be very difficult, particularly with weapons. And what you can do is you can farm bosses in order to try and get drops to help you get a higher chance of getting uniques or, you know, rare items that are really good. Rare items are pretty rare in this game. So if you find yourself getting gear stuck, which can happen to you, I highly recommend finding a boss or two and just going to farm them, even if they're a little bit lower level than you, because it will help you get some gear that will allow you to progress. And you don't have to do this just once. Like, you can farm some bosses until you get some better gear and then progress the game several hours and then maybe find another boss that you want to farm and farm that boss. This can really prevent you from getting to a part of the game later where you're fighting a very difficult boss that you can't get through and have to go do this anyway. And something else that's kind of related to bosses, if you plan on farming them a lot, or you may have noticed if you're fighting them that's not as relevant to other enemies, maybe elite enemies, but not general enemies as much, is the Stagger Mechanic or Stun Mechanic. There's a little bar near the health bar of bosses particularly, and enemies as well, but that shows you how much stagger buildup you have on them. That allows you to kind of like stun them once you fully fill that bar. And this is a popular strategy, particularly against difficult enemies, because it renders them useless for a certain amount of time, like 5 seconds or so. Depends on the boss. Some of them are shorter, some are longer, etc. But it renders them useless, allowing you to get free damage in, and a lot of times it will also increase the damage that you're doing to them while this happens. And different skills have different amount of stagger buildup. You can use support gems to increase the amount of stun buildup on enemies, etc. So consider using this as a strategy, because you can get through a lot of tough phases on bosses that are about to do some attack that you're not really good at dodging or blocking, etc., and stun them right before they do it in order to prevent that from hitting you at all. The next thing that I want to mention is that once you get to Act 2, there's going to be a part of the game where you get to do a trial, and this is going to allow you to ascend, which is essentially going to get you to pick kind of like a subclass passive skill tree that's going to give you a certain focus for the class that you chose. So right now in early access, each class has 2 to choose from. So these are very unique to the class that you pick, and you can't pick ones outside of your class. So your class is going to determine what 2 ascensions that you can choose from at the moment, and you'll be able to see these when you get to your trial. Now the trial itself, in my opinion, is very difficult if you have made your way all the way into Act 2 and you didn't really get stuck anywhere and you've been just breezing along. It can be a very difficult challenge at that moment. So it's possible that you may need to come back and do the trial after gaining a few levels, as it'll be a little bit easier. That's what I did the first time. So don't worry if you get stuck on the trial, and don't brute force your way through it. If you can't, you can always come back a little bit later and try again. However, your choice of ascension is a permanent choice. So you should really take a minute when you're looking over the ascensions to choose from for your class, see what the skills do for these, and really decide what's going to be best for your build. And you'll gain points for this skill tree separately than the passive skill tree as you do more trials from progressing the game. So if you're wondering how you get more ascension skill points, just keep progressing the game and look out for further trials. And the last tip I want to give you is not a combat mechanic or build tip at all. It's a social tip. A lot of people have been asking how to invite their friends to the game or how to play with their friends. If you hit the J button, you can actually see a screen that will pop up, and you can go down to the bottom and put in the player name of your friend and find them, and then be able to invite them to your party that way. So if you've been having trouble inviting your friends or finding your friends, or you can't figure out how to do that, that's how you do that in order to invite them. You can start a guild that way, etc. But that's there. So that wraps up our video on beginner tips for Path of Exile 2. I hope you guys found this useful. This was aimed at like brand new players or players that are not as familiar with Path of Exile. If you're a veteran player, you probably knew a lot of these things already, and some of these things you will figure out on your own after you play. But this was just to try and answer some of the questions that people have that they have right out of the gate. Like, for instance, how do I get more support skill gem slots for a specific skill? I know I had that question when playing for a long time. But generally speaking, if you're not sure why you're not getting something, how to get higher level skill gems, or how to get certain other types of skill gems, support skill gems, etc., or even just consumable items, the main strategy I would suggest is just keep progressing the game. As you progress the main campaign, a lot of these things will become available to you, and it will just keep answering all of your questions. So instead of worrying too much about it, just keep playing the game, and a lot of these things will come into your lap that way. And the other thing that I will say before I wrap up this video is that there are tons of consumable items in Path of Exile 2, and it can be really, really overwhelming, particularly for new players. So what I highly recommend that you do if you're a new player is just stick them in your stash for now and try not to worry about them and keep playing the game. They won't have that much of an impact on your gameplay from the very beginning, because a lot of these can be used later on to make better items better, etc. So try not to worry about them, stick them in your stash until you become more familiar with the mechanics of the game, and then you will start to find uses for them. But at the beginning, don't worry about them too much and just hang on to them until later. So how are you guys liking Path of Exile 2 Early Access? Does it play like Dark Souls mixed with an RPG? Was I right about that? Let me know in the comments below.